Greetings, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I hope you've had a good week. We really appreciate you joining us again today. We've been starting a new series. In fact, we started it last week, and the new series was about the end times, or the last days. And the subject is, you might ask, well, what exactly is that? You probably know what it is, but let me just kind of tell you what at least in my mind, what I'm thinking it is. When we're talking about the study of eschatology or the end times or the last days, we're talking about that period of time that's just prior to Jesus' second coming. And it also actually includes Jesus' second coming. But we kind of got started last week, and we're talking about why it's actually taken so long for Jesus to return from the time that he said he was going to come. It's been like over 2,000 years, and we're referencing a couple of scriptures in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. And in those two verses, the first one was just basically telling us that God's time is not like our time. God is not, he's just not confined to time. He can see the past, present, and future. We live in a time world. And so his time is not like ours. And then the second verse was talking about that God's really long-suffering. That is to say, when Jesus returns, the time for people to be saved will be over with. And so God is long-suffering. He's not willing that anybody would perish. He wants everyone to come to him. But also he wants us to know that his promises are sure, that he's not slack about his promises, but he'll always keep his promises. And we talked about that last week, but today we're going to be talking about something different about the end times. So we're going to be looking at a passage from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. That's several verses, but we'll kind of combine some of those verses so it won't seem like a whole lot of verses. So we're going to be looking at that, and what we're going to be looking at is the kind of conditions that will be prevalent prior to Jesus' coming. Because Paul tells us there'll be a certain type, people will have a certain type of disposition or attitude that will prevail. And he mentions this in these passages. In fact, let me just go ahead and read the first passage. Verse 1, Paul says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come." And I wanted to emphasize those first three words that Paul said. He said, "But know this." So I'm thinking that what he wants us to do is, this is really something that he wants us to think about. He says, "But know this." What is it that he wants us to think about? This is what he wants us to think about in regard to the end times. He's saying that in the last days, the last days, perilous times will come. And so we could just say that when that period of time comes, it'll be a really difficult time. It'll be a time that'll be really, really hard to deal with. It'll be a time that'll be dangerous, and it'll be a time that'll be really grievous. So we, as Christians, we're excited about Jesus is coming. We're looking forward to it. We don't know when it is, but there are things in the Bible that kind of give us some hints and let us know about kind of how the times will be. So it'll be an exciting time, but I think it's also interesting to know that Paul says that it will be a perilous time. And so we may ask this question, well, what is it that makes it perilous? Why is it going to be perilous? We could just say this, it'll be because of the prevailing attitudes of the day. And so we're going to look at verses 2 and 3, and I think you'll see in verses 2 and 3 that Paul will begin to describe the attitude that will be the general mindset of people just prior to the return of Jesus. Now, This will be what we call the end times, but I like to call it the untimes. And I'll explain what I mean when I'm saying the the untimes, when I get into these verses. Let me just read these verses. And so Paul says, "For men will be lovers of themselves. They'll be lovers of money. They'll be boasters. They'll be proud. They'll be blasphemers. They'll be disobedient to parents." And here's the untimes, the word un. Notice it says they'll be unthankful. They will be unholy. They will be unloving. They will be unforgiving. All of those things that Paul said, that's kind of why I said it'll be the untimes. Paul also says that during that time they'll be slanderers. Now what does that mean? It means that they will destroy. They're willing, more than willing to destroy other people by telling lies about them. And they'll be without self-control, Paul says, brutal, despisers of good. Imagine that, having an attitude where you're not good and you actually hate those that do try to be good. So the Apostle Paul, in these verses, he didn't pull any punches at all in his descriptions of the attitudes that many will have during that time. Now, let's look a little bit closer. Let's see if we can focus in a little closer on those verses. And I've tried to divide those verses up into three characterizing attitudes. The first attitude would be what they love. The second one would be what they do. And the third one would be what they're unwilling to do. So what is it that they love? Well, Paul says this, that they love themselves. And you've probably heard of the generation that we're living in today. A lot of people call it the me generation. So they'll love themselves. He says they'll love money and they'll love pleasure. In fact, Paul says they love pleasure more than they love God. And if that's the case, then people have actually turned pleasure into a god, if that makes sense. So that's the things that they love. Now, what is it that Paul says that they do? So he says they boast, that is, they're boasters. They're proud or they're arrogant. He says they're blasphemers, and that simply means that they don't mind saying evil things about things that are good and that are holy. And then he says they're disobedient, and that just means to say that they have a resistance and a rebellion against all authority. Now, the third thing that I wanted to mention is what they're unwilling to do. And we mentioned a while ago, we've kind of changed the name of the end times to the untimes, but what is it that they're unwilling to do? Well, Paul says they're unwilling to be thankful. They're not grateful. And then he says that they're unwilling to be holy. That is, that they'll be profane. And they're unwilling to be loving. That is, to really care, genuinely and truly care for other people. And lastly, they're unwilling to forgive. That is, they're unwilling to show mercy. Now, I'd like to say that was all that Paul said about those attitudes, but actually he included this. He said they'll lack self-control, they'll be brutal, they'll be hating good, they'll be traitors, they'll be headstrong and haughty. So that kind of explains why the time just prior to the coming of the Lord will be perilous times. It'll be because of people's attitude. Now, verse 5 tells us what we're to do, our response to it. So Paul says in verse 5, having a form of godliness, he says, but denying its power. And he says, and from such people turn away. Wow, that's not a flattering description of the attitude that will be just before the time that Jesus returns. But Paul's advice to us is that we should avoid those people. In fact, he says, turn away from them. Now, we may think this. We may think that time where people will have that prevailing attitude is like a long, long time away. It'll be, that's a long time out there before it gets that bad. And you may be right. It may be a long time. But I can just say this. I can see things now that just a few months ago, just a few months ago, that I didn't see or even think I would even imagine would happen. That's happened. So it's kind of makes me think that the world is like, I don't know, it's just like maybe it is getting closer to the time that Jesus is coming back, because there's some really crazy things going on and people are doing crazy things. I think it was just a week or so ago where they piled a stack of Bibles and they burned the Bibles, and on top of the pile of Bibles burning, they threw the flag and burned it. It just seems, I couldn't imagine that would happen here in our country. So I guess my point is, since my subject is about the end times and the last days, I just wanted to mention what would be the mindset of people just prior to the coming of the Lord. And I think Paul tells us, gives us a really, you might say, a really frank description of people's attitudes. So I hope that's been helpful to you. I hope it hadn't been too awful negative. We need to know. The Apostle Paul said this. He said, "But know this." So we should know it. But there's a good thing that we have. Listen, we have our Bible to study. We have our churches that we can go to and fellowship, and we have a wonderful God who loves us and cares for us. And it just hopefully it'll just help us to be closer to Him and get more and more prepared for that time. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I really appreciate you watching and tuning in, and we're gonna continue this series a few more. I've got quite a bit more verses I want to share with you that'll be talking about some of the other things that'll be happening, not necessarily about people's attitude, but what we might expect when Jesus comes back. So we'll be talking about that at another time. I hope you have a really good week. So thank you again for joining us.